Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateacherhistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateacherfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateacherhistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that George Washington viewed himself as the American Cincinnatus and at first really did not want to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, but Madison finally convinced him? And that when discussing the issue of slavery, the founders actually passed a provision including a Fugitive Slave Act all the way back in 1787. And that while the Founding Fathers were really good at making world-changing governments out of nothing, they arguably were even better at holding their liquor. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn about that and more in episode 78, Extra Credit, the Constitutional Convention, Behind the Scenes. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 78. It is my first Extra Credit episode in way too long. And to celebrate, I have a special guest on with me today. He is a host of a fantastic podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. And it is the one and only Professor Greg Jackson. Greg, thanks for joining me today.
My absolute pleasure, Chris, and you're far too kind with this one and only. Greg Jackson's way too common of a name. There's another professor with this name.
That's true. That's probably accurate, but maybe not at American history.
That could be fair. Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't you just take a brief moment before we dive into it and introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. So I am a professor at Utah Valley University. I'm also the assistant director of national security studies here. But perhaps more interesting to your audience is, I host History That Doesn't Suck, and it's a story-driven history of the United States. I mean, it's kind of how we connected, right? Is we nerd out in the same way. So it's a little irreverent, but hardcore researched, and feel free to check it out. We'd love to have you.
Very cool. Well, yeah, absolutely. If you're listening to this, if you haven't heard of History That Doesn't Suck, check out Professor Jackson. It is a fantastic podcast covering a lot of the same stuff that we cover here and a lot of different stuff, which is great. Where can they get in touch with you?
So you can reach out through social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're on all of those.
Is it just History That Doesn't Suck?
Facebook, it's History That Doesn't Suck. Instagram and Twitter did not like that long name of ours. So it's like THTDNT suck. Basically drop the vowels. I'm also on Twitter at Prof. Greg Jackson, PROFGREGJACKSON. So yeah, there you go.
Very cool. Very cool. So reach out to him, check out the podcast, and thanks again for coming on.
My pleasure.
We're going to cover a few different topics today. So do you just want to dive into it?
Yeah, let's just get to it. Let's do this.
Great. So I think, as we briefly prepped before this episode and sent some notes back and forth, the first thing we wanted to cover is James Madison. Absolutely. And any and all James Madison stuff, especially prior to the convention, things that I didn't really dive into very much. But I always found it very curious and I sort of teased it at the very beginning of the episode, that George Washington, following the Annapolis Convention, when Hamilton and Madison decided they wanted to have another convention in Philadelphia, George Washington really did not want to attend that convention, and he sort of viewed himself as the American Cincinnatus. And I mean, I don't know. What have you thought about that? I've always found that I'm not sure how I feel about his desire not to attend.
Well, George, I'm going to take a page from his step grandson here. And, obviously his family, and by the way, I just got to clarify, first name basis with all the founding fathers. So that's just how I roll. That's how it is on my podcast. It's how I'll be here tonight. The habit has stuck.
No problem.
So my boy, George, his step grandson describes this as the happiest phase of his life. This small period between the Revolutionary War and then getting sucked back into the national sphere as, leading the Philly Convention and then being president. Honestly, I think the poor guy, he's tired, he's arthritic. He has few teeth. His health isn't that great. And I
was about to mention, he doesn't have any teeth left. Really.
Yes. Yeah. So, the idea of traveling on those more than lackluster, not so interstate roads of theirs, to keep playing at the game, I think he feels like he's kind of done his bit for not king and country.
Yeah. And I also think that there's that, consistency principle in social psychology going on too, because at the end of the war, he more or less said that he was done.
Right.
And that his public service was over and he was stepping down to allow the next generation to come in to, try to determine what they're going to do next, which I also always found was really interesting about the Constitutional Convention. And I haven't mentioned in either of the two previous episodes that I've talked about it, but the Constitutional Convention is a totally different generation than the guys that experienced the Stamp Act.
Yeah.
And the Sugar Act. It is literally 20 years later. It's a totally new generation.
Yeah, even look at the names that were batting around. What happened to James Otis, right? Yeah. Haven't heard from that guy in forever. Sam Adams has kind of fizzled out of the...
Patrick Henry's not there.
Yeah, yep. Of course, he's going to be kind of pissed that this Constitution happens.
Yes, he will.
Yeah, but
that's very accurate.
All these guys who were such big figures in the beginning. I think the best way we can illustrate this, though, is think about this for a second. The crew that meets up in Philadelphia, you've got Ben Franklin, 81 years old at this point. And then you've got guys like James Madison, he's 37. Alexander Hamilton, what's his exact age? I want to say he was 33, maybe 32. Early 30s.
Yeah, I was about to say, he's a little younger than Madison. I know that. Yeah.
But, point being, that's like a 50-year age gap, between Ben and Alex. So...
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And also when you think about it, and, when we talk about the different issues that go on during the convention, you can sort of understand it in that during the 1760s, you have a lot of states' rights, get off my lawn type of patriots. But much of the men like Hamilton and Madison and these younger delegates, they grew up in the age of war in which all of the Americans, quote unquote, came together during the war and they set aside their state identification and they fought together. And so I think they take on just a totally different approach to viewing the role of the federal government because of their experiences, their different experiences in the 60s and then into the 70s and then into the 80s.
Yeah. You think about these earlier guys who just want to get rid of the crown. That central government seems to be the big issue. That's where Parliament's keeping them in check. But then when you get to the revolution itself, someone like Alexander Hamilton, for instance, as the aide-de-camp to George, he is seeing the ills that come from a lack of any sort of central government. He knows what it is to have an army that isn't properly funded, to see officers that are going for 5 freaking years without pay. Yeah. So, for them, they see that the lesser of two evils is to have something that holds them together. And in fact, as we'll get to a little bit later, Alex goes pretty far overboard compared to a lot of others. And I think that speaks
for sure.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I also think that experience in the war is really important too, because George Washington was the seminal figure at the Constitutional Convention, and by the time it all kicked off, he was more or less convinced that a national government was the way to go. And one of the reasons why Madison was able to convince him, and it didn't take a ton of convincing, was because of Washington's experience in the war.
Yeah.
I mean, he was trying to fight a war and get things from Congress that they could not give him, and he saw just how inefficient and ineffective an extremely weak central government is at very desperate and serious times.
Yeah, I mean, think about him going through the Newburgh, conspiracy, which I know you covered.
Yep.
That's going to leave a psychological scar. You're not going to walk away from that and be like, yeah, this Congress, this is working. This is great. This is solid.
And then during Shays' Rebellion, you have his buddy Henry Knox writing him letters, basically exaggerating everything, right. Making Washington feel like it's like Revolution version 2. And so, of course, he grew anxiety over that. And so, like, by March of 1787, Washington had more or less come full circle and wanted some real changes to be made in writing. And he said that the convention should, quote, adopt no temporizing expediment, but probe the defects of the Constitution to the bottom and provide radical cures, whether they are agreed to or not. And one thing I haven't really talked about too much in like my past couple narrative episodes is this idea that I think I ended episode 76 saying that, for the most part, people knew they were going to write a new government. And I do want to hedge that a bit because there were a lot of men that didn't expect that. But those that did plan on writing a new government, like Madison, Washington, eventually many others, Hamilton, they were going to go all in.
Oh, yeah.
Because they recognized that, like, if we stop short and ratify a government that still is too weak, then we're totally screwed because, I mean, how are we ever going to fix that? It will take generations for those cracks to show enough, for people to be willing to do something about it, right?
Yeah, and so, I mean, they show up with their A game. They're ready for this. I mean, James Madison, who I am going to lovingly refer to by his nickname, Little Jemmy. I'm sorry, it's my favorite nickname of all the founders.
It's a pretty good one.
Right? I mean, he is the shortest, or will be, the shortest president that, at least to date. Maybe someday we'll have someone who is shorter than 5'4", but...
not in today's society. I don't think so. I don't think
right.
You could have a 5'2" person up there debating someone 6'2".
Not with television.
Yeah, no, not with television today.
Yeah, in fact, I would say he would have been absolutely unelectable in the 21st century.
Yeah, 100. So he was 5'2", 5'4", something like that. He was really small. He was 130 pounds soaking wet. Yeah. And he
balding. Let's not forget that.
Yep.
And no offense to those who are balding. Just these are. It casts.
I'm balding a little bit, so I'm a little offended. But that's okay.
This used to come down a little further here in these little sides.
Yeah.
But I mean, he's severely balding, and when you compare that to someone like, I don't know what George's hairline's doing, but George Washington is a foot taller than him.
Yeah.
And just the psychology.
And even when you have guys in his own generation like Hamilton, who for the most part was pretty quiet during the convention outside of his, like crazy ideas that he threw out in May. Yeah. But I mean, he is handsome. He's brilliant. He has a full head of hair. He is loud. He's confident. I mean, just a totally different figure from the same generation. I mean, Madison's buddies at Princeton actually were worried about how long he would live because they thought that he was just like such a tiny, frail human being that he would just like crumble to pieces eventually.
The term hypochondriac, right?
Yep.
I mean that's him too. So I mean, it's not just his buddies. He thinks he's gonna, pass away.
And that's one of the reasons he didn't marry till much later in life, and that's one of the reasons why, if I recall correctly, without going down too much of a rabbit hole with Madison, but
he
didn't marry till later.
No, he didn't. I mean, when he does marry Dolly Dolly, her husband, her first husband's passed away. She's a widow. And Madison.
She was a big deal.
Oh yeah, no, she's
wealthiest woman in Virginia, correct? Yeah,
well,
that was a big deal.
When Madison runs, now I'm blanking on who ran against him when he gets elected as our fourth president. But his opponent, whom he defeats, says something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, if I had just run against James Madison, this would have been a different election. But having to run against Dolly, I had no hope. She compliments him. She brings all the things that he doesn't. Beauty, poise, being able to command a room, being able to win over people. These are all things that our dear friend little Jemmy just lacks completely. The dude's smart, at least when it comes to philosophy. He can wrap his head around different forms of government like no one's business. But yeah, he's going to be the last person picked for the kickball team every time.
Yes. That's very true. That's very true. And I'm sure that it was very surprising to many of the participants at the convention. In Madison, and by the way, the election of 1808, Madison defeated Pinckney, who we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Crushed him.
There we go.
Crushed him.
There we go.
Which makes sense because Madison was, Jefferson's boy, and so Jefferson, for the most part, was still pretty popular in 1807.
Yeah.
But Madison more or less said he was going to go all in, and that if he did not come up with a government that was radical, so to speak, that it would be unworthy, quote, unworthy of being attempted for him to even try anything else. So when Madison comes into the convention, he basically has his new plan for government, and he says, I more or less boiled down his monologues to 5 major things. If there's anything else you'd like to add, please let me know. But at number 1, if sovereignty is in the states, then federal laws are all really just recommendations, which we more or less saw from the Articles of Confederation and the Revolution. Number 2, he claimed that state governments could be just as dangerous and overpowerful if there was no check, because the aristocrats and the factions within the state could take control and abuse the people. And he also talked about the danger of factions and interest groups. This was something he was very paranoid about and very anxious over in this country with this enormous power vacuum at the top, that the wealthy and the elites would be able to form factions that were against the common interest of the American people. And what's interesting, which I'll dive into more detail on my podcast about in episode 79 on the ratification process, is that the common sense at this point, I believe put forth by Montesquieu, was the idea that a republic is way better in a smaller, less populated area.
So, Montesquieu, he writes the spirit of the law back in... Maybe I should go down that road.
Well, yeah, that's okay. See, this is what happens when you record live, right? And you just start having a conversation about history. I love it. This is very real.
But it was ballpark 1750.
Okay, yeah, it's close enough.
And he specifically calls for 3 separate branches of government. This is where we get executive, judiciary, and legislative as 3 distinct entities. Anyhow, there we go. Glad we can work the French in.
Exactly. And basically one thing Madison says is there's this idea that republics can only exist in smaller areas, less populated areas, but in fact, the larger the area, the better the republic, because that way you can have even more factions and even more competing interests. Therefore, you can almost guarantee that one will not become tyrannical over the rest.
Yeah, and he fleshes this out in one of the Federalist Papers.
Yeah. Federalist 10, I believe.
Yeah. His kind of most famous one, I would say.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And we'll talk all about that.
I'm sure you will.
Madison J. and Hamilton.
Yeah.
They love it.
Not trying to get ahead, but yeah.
No. Feel free. So by the time 1787 rolls around, right? The Constitutional Convention, we're here. I've already covered it for 2 episodes, but I know that you wanted to talk specifically about 2 other plans that were proposed. Yeah. The first was by the loser of the 1808 election, which we've established, right?
That's right.
James Madison is the 4th president. Charles Coatsworth Pinckney of South Carolina. So why don't you give us just sort of an overview of what this was all about?
Yeah, I mean, it's in many ways, I think you could almost just say it's the Virginia Plan light. I have no I'm totally semi-joking here. This is not off a primary source. This is me just speculating as a historian. But there is a part of me that wonders if the very vain Pinckney didn't listen to little Jemmy drop this. Well, actually, I apologize. He's taking notes. It's our buddy Edmund
Randolph.
who's laying out Jimmy's plan, which again is the way to go because little Jimmy has no
and
personality.
the Virginia plan for those of you following along.
I apologize. I'm flying. Assuming people listen to earlier episodes.
They do.
Right. Okay. Good. Damn it.
I'm sure. Yeah.
So there's part of me that just thinks that this vain South Carolinian sort of went, well, I want to be up there. I want someone to listen to me. I have an idea. But, in short, it's very similar to the Virginia plan. And we don't have a lot of details, partly because William Jackson is the worst secretary in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
As far as I know,
he redefines the idea of being a secretary because he really didn't write anything down.
Yeah, when you talk about phoning it in, yeah, this guy phoned it in. Yeah. I don't even know what he was doing. It's not like he even had a smartphone to play on, right? Like, what is he doing during this time?
I don't know. I believe that Pinckney's plan was found from notes from James Wilson in like the early 20th century. They found it, and they're like, "Oh wow, there was another plan."
Yeah, because James Madison, who's taking the notes, I think he was kind of jealously like, "I'm not writing this down."
I'm not writing this
We're
down.
not doing this.
This dude's copying exactly what I said. He is not earning his way into my notebook.
That's right. Exactly.
And I feel, but that's a really interesting, funny, yet interesting perspective to take, because I would assume when Edmund Randolph gets up, these Virginia delegates and some of the Pennsylvania delegates have been there for a couple weeks, and they've been like going, and having some drinks and a good time and doing a ton of debating. And Madison basically came with a plan for an entirely new government and pitched it to everyone and hashed it out and edited it and everything else.
And let's point out that, this, first of all, they have the opportunity to do this because everybody's late. Because again, back to those sucky roads that I alluded to earlier, everyone's late. So of course, who shows up on time?
And the states were in no rush to, propose people.
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, sure, we'll get around to it.
Yeah, because no big deal, whatever. They're not feeling the urgency that little Jimmy does. So when, of course, Virginia, fairly close by, and Pennsylvania kind of get the delegates there first, it creates this small, intimate, setting where the more introverted James Madison feels more comfortable in being able to talk to his own, if you will, countrymen, Virginians. And it's a small crowd. So it plays to his personality type. I don't know that the Virginia plan would have hit the ground running quite the way it did if everyone had actually been engaged and shown up on time. I think that's an interesting and worthwhile footnote to add.
Well, for sure, because I would assume that when Randolph got up and gave the 15 points of Madison's plan, it really put everyone on their heels.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure they were looking around thinking, oh, crap, these guys are... Virginia's ready to go.
Yeah.
Like, they're not messing around. And although Randolph comes up and says that they're revising the Articles of Confederation, when he begins, it became very clear to everyone this is an entirely new government. And that's why you have many of the small states for the first 2 or 3 weeks really on their heels, playing the defensive, because they're furiously trying to figure out how they're going to stop this momentum in the middle of this convention.
Well, I know you've already gotten into it, so I won't go into the details, but, William Patterson, to quote him, he says, "We have no power to go beyond the federal scheme." It's just mind-boggling to some of these guys like William that this would even be thrown out there.
And by federal scheme, basically, the point I want to make. So just, and this is something you got into in one of your episodes, but really the difference between a national government at this time and a federal government would be a national government would be a central government with much more power, supremacy over the states in many different areas, and really all of the other states. Not subservient to, but it have to answer to the federal government, either directly or indirectly.
In fact, here, let me speak really quickly to Pinckney, and then let's shift to Hamilton, because he's a great example of that, right? So, Pinckney has this bicameral legislature, the House, where you've got one representative for every 1,000 Americans. Think of what a mess that would be today. That'd be a big house,
right? Yeah, that'd be a big house.
Then the House would elect the Senate. This Congress together would elect the president. So, you see how each of these are kind of building on top of each other. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of direct democracy. Not that there's much direct democracy, even when the U.S. Constitution's finished, right? We've altered that a lot. So it's plenty similar to the Virginia plan. Let's go ahead and jump over to Hamilton's plan then.
Yep.
So Hamilton... he wants, first of all,
Yeah, I believe that was July 18th.
You're correct, sir. It was indeed.
Yeah.
So anyhow, Hamilton's plan, he wants the president to be elected for life. I mean, barring like bad behavior. So essentially, you can impeach the president. But I mean, imagine that if we elected the president for life. Beyond that, the Senate
sounds a lot like a king.
Well, and that's where I believe Madison, in his notes, he writes the, quote, British model. That's how he describes Alex's plan. The Senate is also for life. So basically, it's the House of Lords. But here's where it really connects to this idea of national government as opposed to a federation, a league. The federal government would select the governors of the different states. So, today, I mean, we vote for our state government the same way we do our federal government. If Hamilton had gotten his way, the federal government would be sending someone out. That'd be an entirely different world, assuming that type of government could have even weathered the Civil War, which I highly doubt.
Yeah, that would have been an incredible increase in power.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that many of the men, if Hamilton was talking about this, were looking at him like, are you freaking serious, man?
No question.
Are you really proposing this right now?
They don't even discuss it. Like, his plan is so... my favorite quote from Hamilton during this whole thing is referring to the Virginia plan, right? Little Jimmy's brainchild. He says, to quote, "What even is the Virginia plan but democracy checked by democracy, or pork with a little change of the sauce?"
That's a great quote.
Right?
I like that.
And, I do think, though, he's not the only one. There are, like, Elbridge Gerry, or Jerry, as we say today, from whom we get the gerrymandered, practice.
Very good, yeah.
He says that the evil we experience flow from the excess of democracy. The people do not want virtue, but are the dupes of pretended patriots. So... The important thing that I think we need to remember is that someone like Hamilton, who grew up in the West Indies, which basically makes the Wild West look like the Mild West, they fear on the bottom of things the masses, basically unchecked, uneducated people, as much as they do the despotism that can come from the top. For them, it's about a sweet spot. So that's where he trusts this national government with very limited democracy involved, far more so than what they're working with before.
Yeah, and he's not. One thing that I've always had to remind myself of as I've taught about the Constitutional Convention, because I go all fanboy on pretty much every founding father at some point. And one thing I always remind myself is these were literally some of the wealthiest men in the country.
Yes.
A majority of them, I believe in, and I'm pulling this statistic out of nowhere, but it was something pretty shocking when I read it a few years ago, but like a majority of them are in the top 5 or 10% of 5% of wealth in the country.
Oh, sure.
And so, which really is not surprising at all when you think about it. So, I mean, these guys are protecting themselves as much as anything else. So,
yes,
it's not surprising that they aren't a big fan of democracy, because they recognize what democracy would inevitably do to their wealth and their families.
Isn't it? I'm going to qualify this statement because I might be mixing up my Federalist Papers, but isn't it Federalist number 10 where Madison, he's listing off some of the things that a state government might be stupid enough to do, but a federal government should be kept in check and would never do something so egregious. And one of them is eradicate debts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, spoken like a man who wants to call in debts, who's not on the other side of that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they viewed that as, that was that was an attack on their liberty.
Yeah.
And you can understand why they felt that way. And that actually sort of segues us into the next topic we wanted to cover, which is slavery. Yes. And this is like the elephant in the room. And like if there was any way you could make an elephant like triple its size, that's how big this elephant would be in that room in 1787. And this slavery in the Constitutional Convention is always worth discussing because these men more or less made a Faustian bargain or a deal with the devil, for those of you who have not been forced to read Faust in graduate school. And
that devil is Pinckney, by the way.
Yes. Yeah, pretty much all of the South Carolinian and Georgia delegates.
Yeah.
Yep. But, at this point, I think, and I just want to take a moment here, Greg, and give a little bit of background to slavery at this point in 1787. Every state, except for Massachusetts, had slaves during the Constitutional Convention. And it was obvious to everyone that slavery was by far the most emotionally charged issue that they were going to discuss. But when you think about it, none of them went there to discuss slavery. None of them wanted to discuss slavery. It was just that you could not discuss taxation. You could not discuss representation. You could not discuss, voting without continuing to circle back to slavery. You couldn't discuss property rights. You couldn't discuss the role of federal and state government. I mean, it just kept circling back over and over to the point where Madison actually said, and I don't know if he was surprised by this or anticipated this in the spring when he was preparing, but he said slavery divided everyone far more than any other topic, basically dividing them between the North and the South. I mean, this is back in 1787. We won't have a civil war for 80 more years. And it was clear to Madison at that point how big of a deal that was. And there will be many other events in U.S. history in which we're just reminded of it, that we're just pushing it down the road.
Yeah, I mean, to fast forward just a few years, I think about George Washington being begged basically by Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom are in his cabinet, both of whom hate each other and think that neither does anything good whatsoever in the world. And yet both of them are begging George to stay, to run for a second term, because they're afraid the Union will die. And this is basically, the undertone is that slavery is kind of the crux of the matter. And there's a scrap of paper that's later found in, I love it's so convoluted. It's found at Monticello in Jefferson's notes, and on which he's scribbled down that, it's basically telephone. I think, I'm getting foggy now, but I think it was our buddy Edmund from Virginia who had said that George had said, if there's a split over slavery, that he's going to the North. So the only reason I mention all this is here we are, not even out of the 1790s, and apparently George Washington's, he's playing the mental game of thinking through, where do I go if there's a split over slavery? I mean, that's pretty profound, isn't it? I mean, that it shows just how deeply rooted this issue is, and that, the Civil War, honestly, it's incredible in some ways that it didn't happen sooner.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, the House of Representatives and the Senate worked unbelievably hard to come up with any and all compromises to prevent it from happening. But once again, they were really just, kicking the ball down the road, kicking the can down the road, I believe. Is
that's
term.
It. That is.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one I was going for. And what makes this even more interesting is that you had guys who were anti-slavery, who were pro-emancipation, and very, very powerful guy. I mean, you have founding fathers like Madison, Washington, Jefferson, who are all, and Jefferson wasn't present, but he had written prior to this that he was in favor of emancipating slaves. Yeah. Yet they were all slave owners. Well, and none of them emancipated their slaves in 1780s.
Well, none of them did. The one example I'll point to who's present at the convention is John Dickinson of Delaware.
Mm-hmm. He had already emancipated his slaves, correct?
I have a serious man crush on him because...
Yeah, he's pretty great.
Yeah.
I mean, he's from Delaware, but
other than that, right?
Yeah.
Those local
Sorry,
East Coast,
I'm from Maryland. I can't help it. I can't help it.
No problem.
So when and so then layering in more issues with, I guess maybe not more issues, but more analysis with this slavery issue is what each section of the country really believed. I mean, New England at this time, at least when it came to slavery, didn't say too much about it. They were just like, you know what, this is a moral issue. We really shouldn't legislate this. We know where we stand on this. You guys are going to hell, and we're not. At least those in Massachusetts said that. But they were like, this is a moral issue. Let's stay away. Which is really interesting because you would just assume that they would be the ones that would be standing firm against it. It was actually really the middle states that stand up against it. Virginia specifically, which is really interesting. When the Committee of Detail put together their draft of the Constitution, when they took like the week and a half vacation for the Committee of Detail to work, and then they came back and they were basically like, okay, this is, we put together all the details, and that's why we're the Committee of Detail,
right.
And here it is. They included a clause saying that the slave trade could not ever be abolished, and no one could ever do anything about that provision. And that was more or less John Rutledge, who was head of the committee, who his sole purpose was to get that in there. And that was such a huge deal that Gouverneur Morris, who we'll talk more about later, and George Mason both just sort of lost it, right? Yeah, and they railed against slavery to the point where George Mason actually wrote later that one reason he hated slavery so much was because he saw white children growing up and almost being taught how to be prejudiced and tyrannical towards African-American slaves, which is just fascinating to me that they were thinking like that.
It's not.
I'm sure it's true.
And it's not far off from things that Abigail Adams also says.
Yep.
I remember reading her thoughts as the White House is being finished. And she comments on how the Southerners who own slaves show up with their slaves, and then they sit and they do nothing while they let their slaves do all the work. And basically says something to the effect of, our New England men, they actually know how to work. Obviously, some regional, pride comes out in her words as well. But I'd hardly say that that her observation is without, justice.
Merit. Yeah, for sure. Mason even said, like, God is going to punish this country because of this Faustian bargain that they're trying to make with slavery. But it is the South that stands in their way, specifically, as we mentioned, Georgia and South Carolina.
And so will John Dickinson. You mind if I throw out a little bit of his wisdom?
Of course.
So he says, he writes in his journal, acting before the world, what will be said of this new principle of founding a right to govern free men on a power derived from slaves? The omitting of the word will be regarded as an endeavor to conceal a principle of which we are ashamed.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful.
Right?
Yeah.
Talk about being, ahead of the game for the men in that room.
Yeah, and the vulnerability of basically shaming them for it. Publicly also, and that brings us to something I brought up last episode, is that the word slave doesn't even exist. It was persons.
Right. And that's where I love John's quote, because, anyone who might want to try and play some games about the fact, the word slave isn't in the Constitution. John just called it out. He puts it out there.
Yeah, and they knew exactly what they were doing, and everyone knew it, but that just shows the level of shame that they feel around this issue, that they're not even willing to put the word in there because they know that the deal they're going to make is not one that they'll be able to sleep well at night with. But, in the end, and I always like to play both sides with everything as much as I can, in the end, you could easily argue that if they include something that eliminated slavery, then there would be no country. It wouldn't have mattered. There would be no Constitution because South Carolina and Georgia would never sign on, and maybe even other states. They barely got it ratified, which we'll talk about next episode, but they barely got it ratified as it was.
No, and
they would have had no chance.
James Madison says that. Just, I guess, sorry, I'll just keep quoting people if you don't mind.
No, that's great. You're just so smart.
Well, please continue complimenting me. But no, he said, great as the evil is, a dismemberment of the Union would be worse.
Yeah.
So he's literally, expressing the exact thing that you're saying here. Well, you're playing devil's advocate, but he's giving, he's putting his foot down. He's saying this is the legit situation. South Carolina and Georgia, now I'm putting words into his mouth, but those are the two states that we know they were going to walk if slavery was touched. They would walk. And if they walked, I mean, this thing would have fallen apart.
Well, yeah, no, it's absolutely South Carolina and Georgia. And when they were coming up with the compromise, which I talked about last episode, when they were coming up with the compromise for extending the slave trade to 1808,
Yes.
they actually, Virginia wanted it to be included specifically that, like, we're doing this for South Carolina and Georgia.
Call them
I believe
out.
I think it was Mason. I'd have to check my notes, but I think it was Mason. Yeah, who's basically like, don't throw Virginia in on this. It's not we're not using our leverage to do this.
And of course, let's point out, I mean, Virginia is such a heavy slave state. It's almost like, damn, everyone's going to totally blame it. It wasn't us. It wasn't us,
Yeah. Yeah. And then that actually, and that actually goes to another point too, because one of the reasons why the slave trade was so critically important to South Carolina and Georgia is that, and you can imagine the delegates in South Carolina are just like, yeah, easy for you guys to say, we just had a British army marching through our state for 3 years, taking all of our slaves from us and allowing them to fight in the British Army. I mean, South Carolina and Georgia's slave population was decimated in that regard. There was a lot of property, quote unquote, taken from the slave owners in South Carolina and Georgia.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And Virginia didn't have that problem, really. The war wasn't fought in Virginia for the most part at all, outside of Yorktown. These Virginia slave owners had more than enough slaves. And so they figured if we could figure out a way to end the slave trade, we would then be in a fantastic negotiating position in the basic supply and demand economics. And they'd be in a good spot. Whereas South Carolina and Georgia knew that too. I mean, it was like the worst kept secret at the convention.
Well, and
why Virginia was okay with it.
And we need to remember that the Chesapeake states where slavery is practiced, this is where, for those who've heard the notion that the founding fathers just kind of, they thought this thing was going to take care of itself. You've got soil being depleted that is making it so planters like George Washington have to change crops. They're going to crops that don't require as many slaves. It just does not require as many laborers. So, you have people who are freeing slaves in the Chesapeake area, not because those slave owners are moral and good people like John Dickinson, but because it's economically, it doesn't make sense for them. They're losing money feeding a slave, even with that free labor. They're better off to emancipate or to try and sell them elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, there are lots of reasons where Virginia didn't have its slave population damaged and the economy is shifting for them to be able to kind of sit back and be like, we're cool.
Yeah, exactly. Don't lump us in with this, right? And they're thinking, well, easy for you to say. And that brings us to another provision about slavery that was in the Constitution that I mentioned pretty briefly in my previous episodes is the 3/5 compromise, which I know you went into a little more detail in your episodes, which I really liked. And basically what this more or less meant was that for taxation and representation purposes, for every 5 slaves, they'd be counted as 3. And this, what most people don't realize, was actually determined, this idea, this federal ratio, was actually existed before the Constitutional Convention. In 1783, the Articles of Confederation, when trying to figure out population representation for different things, like how to count the populations and how many delegates go, blah, 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 came up. Madison is the one that came up with the 3/5 fraction years before the convention. And they actually proposed this, but you needed, as you know, under the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states, and they only got 11. So, but informally, this 3/5 fraction was just sort of the accepted norm when considering slaves. So then you get to the Constitutional Convention and you start talking about slaves, and they just sort of fall back to this, this federal ratio. And I always found it, I would always talk about this in class, just like, this is so classic politics that back in 1783, when they were talking about population and how to judge population, the southern states wanted all of their slaves counted as individuals,
right,
and the northern states didn't want any of them counted because they were like, well, they're slaves, they're property to you, so why should they count? And now you get to the convention and they're talking about taxation, and the southern states are like, well, no, these are slaves, they should not count towards, like, they shouldn't be people towards taxation. And then the northern states just do a total 180 and say, well, no, they're people too. You need to count them. So, I mean, it's just politics at its finest.
It is. Well, and, I think it's interesting as we talk about the way, they bounce around and who's wanting what counted. When you look at what the Constitution says, we're Article 1, Section 2.3, where we have the compromise, it also ensures that Indians who are taxed are included, in population count. Indians that are not being taxed will be excluded. So it really is fascinating, and we see why. And it does come down to politics, that African Americans, enslaved African Americans, become the only population that are not being taxed because, of course, they're enslaved. How the hell could they pay taxes? Yet they're being counted for the benefit of, their masters' ability to increase their representation. I just think that's a very interesting note.
Yeah, and that, I mean, without going down a whole other rabbit hole,
which
we keep going with a lot of different things, but one that we haven't really talked about or prepared for on this pod, so we won't. But Native Americans are just totally excluded in the Constitution. They're just like it's more or less, they are their own independent nation. Which just like the cynic in me is like, wow, that must make it, that has to make it just way easier to take all their land if they're an independent nation as opposed to being part of your nation. And by 1924, when America passes the Indian Citizenship Act, we've pretty much taken all the land we need to take, and so now they can be citizens. And that is a very politically incorrect.
Yeah.
and but I can't help but have that, feeling in the back of my mind when we talk about Native Americans during this time, and we'll see if we continue in the podcast, and you've talked about in your pod. They just siphon the land from them.
They do.
Over and over and over, and even when they're told not to by the Supreme Court, Andrew Jackson does it anyway.
Yes, he does.
And so you really can't help but, I can't help but feel that way. But
no, and I mean, look, hey, I love myself some America. I have no problem describing myself as a patriot. But to me, patriotism also means that, it's not just rah. It's being able to look at the warts, to look at, look in the mirror and see your sins and imperfections. I mean, not that I didn't know this stuff professionally already, but doing this podcast, as I'm sure you're experiencing, it is a deeper dive as you go through it. And I mean, there are lots of times where, especially when I'm researching and writing about the treatment of the indigenous peoples and African Americans, it's just hard. Like words don't do it justice. I think that's the best I can even say succinctly,
Yeah, no, and I would agree. And I think that when you talk about the warts and the sins of the past, I think that the only way you can get better is by acknowledging your weaknesses.
Amen.
And then working to fix them. Those that want to ignore that are going to be the same people that rail against others for being, not self-aware enough, like personally. Right. So I think as a country, it's important as a populace for us to be self-aware, no matter where you fall on the certain political issues of today. But to be self-aware is good, and be able to speak honestly and frankly about it, which we both try and do. And then that brings us to the last provision that includes slavery, which is the Fugitive Slave Law. So speaking of embarrassing, moment in the Constitutional Convention, there was a fugitive slave law that already existed under the Articles. It was actually passed in the Northwest Ordinance, and basically this said that a runaway slave should be returned to government officials, and potentially even individual citizens should assist in returning the slaves to their masters. And this was a protection for the Southerners. And just like a quick side story here, Massachusetts hated this. As I mentioned earlier in the pod, Massachusetts was the only state that had outlawed slavery. And this happened in 1781. An escaped slave named Quoke Walker escaped to Massachusetts. He was a runaway slave. And his master caught him and beat the hell out of him to take him back, under his possession, I guess, for lack of a better term. And Walker's friends sued for his freedom. And they went all the way to the Massachusetts State Supreme Court. And they sued for battery, basically, is what they said. This guy came in and he beat the crap out of him, and that's battery. You can't do that to people, right? It's assault and battery. And so the Massachusetts State Supreme Court in 1781 said that the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, which was passed a year before, began with the statement that, quote, all men are created equal, which in their mind meant that slavery was illegal in Massachusetts. So this fugitive slave law was extremely controversial, especially in Massachusetts, because now they had to the federal government was forcing them to actively participate in something that their state had decided was immoral and illegal. And as you know, as a professor of U.S. history, the Fugitive Slave Act is going to come up again and again.
Yes, it is.
And really rear its ugly head just in the antebellum period prior to the Civil War.
Well, and I mean, of course, it's going to be a real sticking point, not to get too far ahead. I mean, to get like 70 plus years ahead, but am I doing good math there? Maybe it's closer to 60. But I mean, when we get into, say, like the Compromise of 1850, yeah, and this gets into the sticky issue of discussions over states' rights, which is going to be used at various times in regard to slavery. And yet here, this will kind of overturn the idea of states' rights. It just shows back to the politics, I think, that we were touching on earlier, where it feels like states are willing to play the federal basically the federal level against the state level, depending on what serves their purposes at any given moment.
Yeah, I think that's called politics.
Exactly.
Right? Isn't that what
sir,
we call
I believe we
it in
do.
the 21st century? Yep. Figure out a way to take the belief in your head about how things should work and seek out information to confirm that belief, and then come up with semantics that give you plausible deniability to believe what you want to believe, and then continue to believe it and run on that platform. That's like politics 101 going back a couple thousand years. Pretty much how it works. I just wrapped up like a couple thousand years.
There we go.
History
we're covered. What are you going to do from here, Chris? I mean, it's done. The podcast is over.
But let's move on as we begin to sort of wind down on this episode. And I want to thank you again. I mean, we're coming up on a pretty marathon episode here, covering a lot of stuff, which I love, and I'm glad you're on here with me. I know you wanted to talk specifically about the role of the taverns, and one tavern in particular, the City Tavern, during the writing and then the celebration after the signing of the Constitution.
Yeah, so September 14th. We don't know exactly who's there. We've got about 55, it might have been 55 exactly, but it was 55 or so guys. They go to City Tavern because, hey, this thing is getting wrapped up. They're celebrating and joining some number of the delegates. We don't know which delegates exactly. The only person we know for sure is George Washington, but I don't know of a historian that doesn't assume other delegates are with him. But he's also joined by veterans who served under him on Christmas Day, 1776, when they crossed Trenton. And they get smashed just beautifully.
Go for it.
I'm just gonna rattle this off here, and I'm cheating. I wrote it down because I want to make sure we capture this in perfect, order.
And you'll have to listen carefully as you listen to this, just so you can take in how much booze they drank.
Just try and visualize, the quantity here. Okay. So I won't read it too quickly, so people can suck it in. No pun
All right.
intended. 60 bottles of Claret, 54 bottles of Madeira, which of course is a wine that was super popular. It's like the Coca-Cola, as I joke in my podcast, of the 18th century. Everyone drinks that. Well, except for Thomas Jefferson. He's too good for it. But anyhow, 54 bottles of Madeira. We got 22 bottles of porter. And then 12 beers. So look at that. Like, what are they bringing? They bring the heavier stuff. Yeah, maybe a little bit of beer, but we've got 8 bottles of cider, 7 bowls, not bottles, bowls of punch. And maybe that sounds like nothing to you because in the 21st century, when we say punch, we tend to think of something that some kid has at his birthday party.
There's no way that didn't have alcohol.
Oh yeah, no, that punch is spiked. Yeah.
Yeah.
And beyond that, it's a party. So they've got live music, cigars, glasses are broken. The total bill, if you translate it to 21st century US dollars, is north of $15,000.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of booze. So clearly they were happy with what they had done at the convention.
When you think about the fact that you have, you try to average that out. We're talking, everyone's had at least 1 bottle of wine, beer, punch. I honestly don't even know how some of these guys held that volume in their body.
Yeah.
Because there are guys like George Washington, he's no prude by any means. One of the big errors I think we've made when it comes to the founding fathers is whitewashing them in ways that they wouldn't have even wanted to be whitewashed. We, coming out of the temperance movement, decided to impose ideas about them, anachronistically. That no one would be embarrassed by this back then. At least that's my impression. But George is not a huge drinker, so someone has to offset him, right? I want to know who the guy is who's like, I got this. I'm making up for all the lightweights here. Don't worry, guys.
Well, I think even today we all know that guy.
It's true. Hey,
we all know that guy.
You know what? I will speculate. If he was there, it's Luther Martin, because that guy was hammered throughout the whole convention anyway.
Yeah, he had a problem.
Yeah. Today we'd call him an alcoholic. In the 18th century, we call him a guy.
He's just a fun guy to be around. Yeah. Well, and just like if anyone has ever been to college before and been to a house party, there's that guy who have no idea whose house it is, who doesn't know what they're celebrating. He just heard there was booze.
Doesn't matter.
And he's going to drink all of it.
Right.
Yeah. And so there were like a handful of those guys who were like, George Washington. Whoa, he was a general. Oh, that's cool. So where's the booth?
Exactly. I heard good things about him or whatever. I'll have another Madeira. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my dad talked about him. Yeah. So I think as we wrap it up, there are a couple people that I know you wanted to just touch on Gouverneur Morris, maybe Hamilton or Washington. I know there are a couple guys that you were like, I want to make sure I have a few minutes to talk about them because they're super interesting characters that deserve to be talked about. And I want to give you the opportunity to talk about them now. Some of these guys at the convention.
Yeah, so just back to making these guys real. Again, one of the things I hate seeing sometimes in history is this idea that they're all a bunch of boring, stick in the mud types who are just super serious and just think about government all day long. Like Gouverneur Morris, James Bond and Don Juan together could not keep up with this guy's social life. He is, I believe I can go ahead and say officially that he may have engaged in, say, an act of Congress in public on more than one occasion. He has a peg leg. And you could see this if you were to go to Signers Hall today, you'll see the statue of him. He's standing with his arm on Ben Franklin's statue's shoulder, and there he is. His left leg, it's a peg leg. He lost it in a cart accident, and the rumor got around. It isn't true, but the rumor is that he tripped and fell under the cart because he was running away from a jealous husband. Because he was known for sleeping with so many women, both married and not married. John Jay, the famous John Jay, one of the Federalist paper authors.
Guy we'll talk about quite a
Right.
bit. Have a treaty named after him.
Yeah. I mean, it might not be the most popular treaty, but hey,
No.
Jay was a good negotiator. It was a crap situation. Anyhow, he said after hearing about Gouverneur's accident, and they were good friends. He said, I wish he'd lost something else. So I mean, this is the guy, right? Like another time, Hamilton, he and Gouverneur, they're great friends. They're at a party, and Alex dares him to go up to George and just slap him on the back and say, and just say anything, but to slap him on the back in a real friendly way. And everyone knows George Washington, while he loves his men, he's super approachable. It's always within your right social class. Like you don't do, you don't cross lines with George. You always follow proper etiquette, right?
Yeah. I mean, he always revered the way the English do things anyway.
Yeah.
Like that, he was a big fan of the English, like secretly, which is sort of weird.
It is. Yeah, I mean, hey, if things had worked out as he originally planned, he'd been in the British Navy.
Yep, very true.
But so Gouverneur takes the bet, and he waits for the right moment as a story's being told, and he slaps George on the back and loudly says, "Whoa, wasn't it so, my old boy?" And the whole room just goes dead silent. And George just stares daggers at him until he kind of like slowly retreats into the background. So, and this is the guy who writes the words. It's Gouverneur who writes "We the People."
Yeah,
He's the one.
He wrote the Constitution.
Yes, like these iconic words that that every American just about, even if they don't like history, they've accidentally learned those words. This is the guy who writes it. I mean, this is a dude with serious personality. I mean, we would definitely call him a womanizer today. He was a bon vivant, We'll play off of his very French-sounding name.
Yeah, no, and I was just saying, I think I mentioned episode 76 that he made up for Madison's quiet countenance.
Yes.
Like they balanced each other out extremely well. And
maybe that's the note to end on, right? Like just that there's a good balance of personalities in there. I mean, I know we've been going for a while, so maybe I'll spare the people of me just fanboying over every single person in the room. But Gouverneur is one of the less well known, especially since Alexander Hamilton's now famous again, thanks to Lin-Manuel. He's made Alexander Hamilton great again, if we may, right?
He has. He very much has. Even though like he was on a $10 bill the whole time.
I know, right? And suddenly everyone's like, everyone
just sort of forgot.
That's who that
it's
guy
like,
is.
Wait, that's who that guy is on the $10 bill?
Yeah.
Like, I just thought that was Washington from the other side.
I figured Hamilton was a nickname.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thanks so much for coming on. I had a lot of fun. Hopefully, you, the listener, really enjoyed it. Check out his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It is a narrative history of the U.S., just like mine. A little different style and goes a bit quicker than mine, but extremely entertaining. And I'm a big fan personally. And you're a bit ahead of me now. You're on the west, right?
Yeah, so we just finished covering the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails, and now we're about ready to unleash war with Mexico. So that's where we're at.
Right, great. A war that we start.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's how we do it. We start it, we win it, we take the land, and then we don't look back.
Yep. Welcome to Manifest Destiny.
Yes, absolutely. America.
That's right.
Greg, thanks so much for joining me. And listeners, thanks for staying on and continuing to listen if you're still there. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.